The Cyprus model for Canada, that is the topic of tonight's byline. I told you last week that what happened in Cyprus could come to Canada. No, not in terms of government needing a bailout from the International Monetary Fund, but in terms of banks, bank failure, the seizure of deposits when a bank fails. My argument then and now is that if a bunch of Western European politicians and bankers can think this is a good system, then a bunch of Canadians could do the same. Since then, many of you have emailed me pointing to a few key passages in the federal budget that seem to show this is what would be the new Canadian regime, the bail-in, it's called. I blogged about this on the weekend, got a lot of traffic. It was after I got what appeared to be confirmation from Finance Minister Jim Flaherty's Director of Communications. Now they're saying, don't worry. Deposits are not at risk and neither are taxpayers if one of Canada's big banks fails. Well, somebody's money will be at risk, and quite frankly, I don't want it to be the taxpayers. I'll get to the details of the Canadian system in a moment, but first, for everyone angry that deposits over $100,000 would be at risk, consider a couple of key things. One, weren't most people against the bailouts to the big U.S. banks back in 2008, 2009? And that's a big part of what spawned the Tea Party in 2009. In 2011, the bank bailouts were what animated the Occupy movement. No one wanted their tax dollars going to bail out billionaire bankers. Now, what the Harper government is saying in the budget is that they do not want taxpayers to bail out bankers now in this country. Canada did not have a direct bank bailout in 2008-2009. Now, the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation did buy billions of dollars worth of mortgages from the big banks to free up some capital when the global market was tight. But that was done on commercial terms. And in fact, the government made money off that. It didn't cost taxpayers anything. Secondly, unlike Cyprus, if a big bank were to fail in the immediate future, it would be the bank alone failing. In Cyprus, the government is failing as well. And in order to get a bailout from Europe, they had to agree to let the banks raise deposits to recapitalize. So what's happening here? Well, on page 145 of the budget, or page 155 if you're reading in the PDF format on your computer at home, the budget states that the government is proposing to implement, quote, a bail-in regime for systematically important banks. This regime will be designed to ensure that in the unlikely event that a systematically important bank depletes its capital, the bank can be recapitalized and returned to viability through the very rapid conversion of certain bank liabilities into regulatory capital. This will reduce risk for taxpayers. Isn't that what we want, to reduce risk that taxpayers will bail out TD's Ed Clark or CIBC President Gerald McCaughey? I mean, McCaughey earned $9 million last year. His bank had profits of $3.3 billion. Clark earned $10 million and his bank made $7 billion in profit. I don't want to bail out those guys. Now, despite all of this, it's not inconceivable that the bank could fail. That's why the government's proposing these rules. That's why there's new international rules that are being applied to Canadian banks. Last Friday, I asked Finance Minister Jim Flaherty's office about Canada adopting a model similar to Cyprus. Dan Miles, his spokesman, said Canada would not bail out banks. It would, however, allow a bail-in. Here's a quote from Miles. Under bail-in arrangements, a failing financial institution has to tap into their own special reserves or assets which they have been forced to put aside to keep operations going. Now, that leaves questions about what assets, or in the proper term used in the budget, liabilities, the bank can tap into. Each Canadian is insured for up to $100,000 in deposits. Few of us have more than that sitting in a bank account. So our retirement accounts, whether they're RRSPs or registered RRIFs, are they up for grabs? Miles now says no, that the banks will use debentures and other debt instruments to recapitalize. Quote again, the bail-in regime is to protect both taxpayers from having to bail out banks and depositors from having to take a haircut like we've seen in Cyprus. If a bank is having severe difficulties, the bail-in regime would force certain debt instruments to be converted to equity to recapitalize the bank. Now, this will protect deposits to a degree, but if anyone thinks uninsured deposits are safe in the event of a bank failure, then you're fooling yourself. If you've got substantial retirement funds, all with a single bank, I would keep a close eye on that bank. Know what they're doing, know what kind of situation they're in, and I would recommend talking to a pro to make sure that you are protected. And that's the byline.
few years ago, I thought, should I stay in England or should I stay in Cyprus and settle down and make a family? So within 3 years, I settled down, got married, children, bought a new home, and all of a sudden, boom, everything's gone.
It is scary what's happening in Cyprus. Here for further discussion on this, bring some perspective to it, is Tom Velk. He is an economics professor at McGill University in Montreal. A learned man, joins us today from Vermont. Tom, you know, I've been having people tell me for more than a week, Lilley, you're crazy. That's never going to happen here. Why are you fear-mongering? But there you see what was in the budget. You see what the finance department officials are saying. And you look at what's going on in the world. How can you not be concerned?
I think you're right to be concerned. You know, Canada is relatively well governed these days compared to the other countries in the G7. But, you know, that's like saying we're the cleanest girl in the whorehouse. It still pays to protect your family jewels, I think, when you're exposed to her. And I think it makes sense to be protective and to be worried about your financial future and to be very watchful about where your money is. If a bank does go down, all kinds of things can happen that could, at a minimum, slow down your ability to get your money. They may move your deposits to a healthier bank. They may shut things down while there are investigations that go forward. They may say, let me be very sure that you are exactly insured. You, of course, would be worried about any investments that you had, RRSPs, pension funds, and so on, that could easily go over $100,000. So, and of course, it's already happening. Inflation already takes money out of your bank account, and inflation, of course, is engineered. There are at least 4 kinds of very serious inflation that are going on in Canada right now. There's engineered inflation. The Bank of Canada purposefully creates 2 or 3% inflation every year. You've got imported inflation from America and other places where they're spewing out paper money by the fire hose. You've got growth pressure inflation out of China, where they're pushing up the price of commodities. And you've got running scared inflation. People are running to gold, to property, and so on, away from money and away from bonds, because everybody fears that governments, even good ones like Canada, will either inflate their way out, will run their currencies down, will run the exchange rates down, or will tax you in various ways, accusing you of being a rich man and so on. Tom, paper money is at risk.
Tom, as you're talking, we're seeing pictures of all these politicians from all the parties in the Commons run past us. And, you know, even the guys that I like, I don't necessarily trust to safeguard my money in times of a crisis. And I was there covering these guys during the 2008 crisis, 2008, 2009. There was a real panic in terms of what was going on. And if things get bad again, then that can happen. The idea of panic sets in not only to markets, but government, and they must be seen as doing something. So they're saying, I think they are headed down the right road in terms of saying to the banks, before you come to us, you look at yourselves first, and you will look at your own money situation. I don't think it's right that I should be bailing out. I don't bank with CIBC, and I'm not going to pick on them for any reason other than that. Why should I bail out CIBC as a taxpayer if they make bad decisions?
Well, you're absolutely right. And as I said earlier, with some seriousness, Canada has been pretty responsible with respect to this whole recession, depression, crisis situation. We have not thrown money around the way the Americans have, for example. But when a crisis strikes, and it will, and it could, as it did in 2008, no government is big enough to stand up against it. And of course, the temptation that every government faces in a crisis is to solve it with paper money and paper bonds. The Americans have been creating money at a rate there's 4 times more money, paper money in the U.S. than there was at the beginning of Obama's term. There are 3 times more debts out there. And of course, a bond is nothing more than another piece of paper that promises to pay some guy in the great by and by a lot of real goods downstream. If you don't have the growth, you don't have the recovery. That's another way that you can look at inflation. Your paper does not buy stuff anymore, and you get very disappointed. Even though they maybe the bank doesn't fail, or maybe it does fail and they give you another bushel basket full of currency, if it doesn't buy very much, what good is it? And that's the danger. The short-run solution that governments have gone to, decayed to, right across the G7, is paper money, paper bonds, paper promises. And when folks wake up to the paper quality and start rushing for gold, silver, commodities, land, what have you, even stocks, the recovery in the stock market, I think, is largely just a build-up on the price side. The price-earnings ratio, to use the techie term, has simply gone up. People are paying more, but they're not getting more.
Well, we'll have to leave it there, Tom, and I'm sure we will chat about this this insanity again in the future. Talk soon.
Okay.
Send me your thoughts, byline@sunmedia.ca.